Brendan Lancaster leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes glinting with amusement as he tossed a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the polished bar top. "Double or nothing," he said smoothly, his confidence unshaken. Across from him, Genevieve Carter folded her arms and arched a brow, unimpressed. "You sure you want to do that?" she asked, her voice laced with challenge. The exclusive Manhattan steakhouse was buzzing with wealthy clientele, but all eyes at the bar had turned toward the absurd scene unfolding: a billionaire betting against a waitress in a game of poker. Brendan was used to winning, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in life. He had built his empire, Lancaster Enterprises, from the ground up, turning it into one of the most powerful financial firms in the country. He didn't lose. Genevieve, however, wasn't intimidated by his money or his reputation. She had been working at the restaurant for the past 2 years, paying off student loans and trying to keep her dream of opening a bakery alive. She had seen all kinds of rich men walk through the doors, but none quite as arrogant or as frustratingly handsome as Brendan Lancaster. She glanced down at the poker hand in front of her, then back at Brendan. "Fine," she said, sliding her last few chips forward. "Let's play." The game lasted only a few more minutes. Brendan's confidence never wavered until Genevieve laid down her cards with a satisfied smile. A royal flush. The bar erupted into cheers and laughter. Brendan stared at the cards, stunned. He had lost to a waitress. Genevieve leaned in, her brown eyes sparkling with triumph. "Looks like you owe me, Lancaster." Brendan exhaled sharply, a slow grin forming. "All right, Carter, what's my punishment?" She tapped her chin, pretending to think. "How about you work one shift here, as a waiter?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Brendan Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in New York, waiting tables. His jaw tensed, but he wasn't one to back down from a bet. "Fine," he said, shaking her hand. "Tomorrow night." Genevieve laughed, genuinely amused. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Brendan had no idea just how much. The next night, Brendan arrived at the restaurant dressed in a crisp white button-down and black slacks, looking every bit the part of a high-end waiter. Genevieve handed him an apron, barely suppressing her smile. "Rule number 1, she said, tightening the apron around his waist. "Customers are always right." Brendan scoffed. "That's a terrible rule." Genevieve grinned. "Yeah, well, welcome to my world." The next 2 hours were absolute chaos. Brendan struggled to balance trays, mixed up orders, and had to endure a particularly entitled couple who sent their steak back 3 times. Genevieve watched with barely concealed amusement as he fought to maintain his patience. By the time the shift ended, Brendan collapsed onto a bar stool, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how you do this every day," he admitted. Genevieve smirked, leaning against the bar. "It's called survival. Something tells me you're not used to struggling." Brendan studied her, intrigued. "And you are?" She shrugged. "Grew up in Brooklyn, single mom, been working since I was 16. Struggling is second nature." For the first time in a long time, Brendan found himself speechless. He had built his empire through ruthless determination, but he had never started from nothing like she had. "I owe you dinner," he said suddenly. Genevieve blinked. "Excuse me." "I lost a bet," he reminded her. "I always settle my debts." She hesitated, wary. Brendan Lancaster wasn't the type of man who asked women out for no reason, but there was something in his expression, genuine curiosity, maybe even admiration, that made her say, "All right, fine, but pick the place." Brendan chuckled. "Deal." Little did they know, that bet was only the beginning. Genevieve chose a small, family-owned pizzeria in Brooklyn, a far cry from the sleek, Michelin-starred establishments Brendan was accustomed to. The scent of fresh basil and melted cheese filled the air as they stepped inside. The checkered tablecloths, vintage posters, and warm glow of string lights created an atmosphere worlds away from the high-stakes corporate realm he ruled. Brendan glanced around, adjusting to the unfamiliar setting. "You really know how to push a man out of his comfort zone," he remarked. Genevieve grinned as she slid into a booth. "You lost a bet. I get to pick." A waiter arrived with menus, but Genevieve waved him off. "Large margarita, extra garlic knots." Brendan arched a brow. "No wine list." She laughed. "If you want that, you're in the wrong place. Here, it's soda or beer." He shook his head, amused. "Beer, then." As they waited, Genevieve leaned back, watching him. "So, tell me, how does a man like you end up betting against a waitress?" Brendan exhaled, resting his forearms on the table. "I don't lose bets. At least, I didn't until last night." A slow smile spread across her face. "So I'm the exception." He studied her, his usual guarded demeanor slipping for a moment. "Seems that way." The pizza arrived, and Genevieve wasted no time pulling a slice free, cheese stretching between the plate and her fingers. Brendan hesitated before following suit, clearly unfamiliar with eating without silverware. She stifled a laugh. "Just pick it up. Promise, no one here cares about table manners." Brendan relented, taking a bite, his brows lifted in surprise. "This is actually good." Genevieve rolled her eyes. "What, did you think I'd take you somewhere terrible just to make a point?" He gestured around. "Assumed you wanted to prove something." She shook her head. "Nope, just wanted to show you that not everything worthwhile comes with a 5-star rating." Brendan leaned back, considering her words. He wasn't used to people challenging his world, making him reconsider what he thought he knew. As they ate, the conversation shifted. Genevieve spoke about her dream of opening her own bakery, the way she tested recipes late at night in her tiny apartment, how she had been saving every spare cent to make it happen. Brendan listened intently, something about her ambition striking a chord. He understood drive, the relentless pursuit of success. But while his world was built on power and numbers, hers was built on passion and resilience. By the time the meal ended, something unspoken had settled between them. An understanding, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. As they stepped outside, the city lights casting a golden hue over the streets, Brendan turned to her. "I'll admit, I didn't expect to enjoy this." Genevieve crossed her arms. "And yet, here you are, full of pizza and a little less insufferable than before." A rare laugh escaped him. "I suppose it deserved that." She tilted her head, studying him. "You're not what I expected either." Brendan met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Maybe that's a good thing. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about boardrooms or stock markets. He was thinking about the woman who had bested him, and the fact that he wasn't quite ready to walk away just yet. Brendan wasn't the type of man who let things linger. If something intrigued him, he pursued it. If something unsettled him, he confronted it. But for the first time in years, he found himself hesitating. It had been 3 days since the pizza night with Genevieve, and yet, no matter how many meetings he attended or deals he closed, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. The way she had looked at him not with awe or deference, but with amusement, as if she saw through the carefully constructed image he had built. He wasn't sure if that intrigued him or terrified him, maybe both. By the time Friday evening rolled around, he found himself standing outside the restaurant where she worked, his hands in his pockets as he debated whether this was a mistake. He wasn't a man who chased things people chased him. And yet, here he was, waiting for her shift to end like some lovesick fool. As the door swung open, Genevieve stepped out, her apron slung over her arm, her hair slightly tousled from the long night. She spotted him instantly, her brows lifting in surprise. What are you doing here? Brendan exhaled, realizing he hadn't actually planned this far ahead. He had simply followed impulse, something he rarely ever did. I was in the neighborhood, he lied, though they both knew better. Genevieve crossed her arms, an amused glint in her eyes. Oh, sure, because billionaire CEOs just happened to wander into Brooklyn at midnight. He let out a slow breath. Fine, I came to see you. She tilted her head, considering him. Why? A question he wasn't sure he had an answer for. I don't know, he admitted. You're different. Genevieve let out a soft laugh. That has to be the vaguest compliment I've ever received. Brendan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself more than anything. He was used to control, to certainty. But with her, everything felt unpredictable. I don't do this, he said finally. I don't pursue people. I don't show up unannounced. But you, he stopped himself, shaking his head. You've been in my head since the night of that bet. Genevieve studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. All right, Lancaster. If you want my time, you're going to have to earn it. His jaw tightened. And how do I do that? A slow smile spread across her face. That's for you to figure out. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Brendan standing there, equal parts frustrated and intrigued. For the first time in his life, he had lost a bet. And now, he had the distinct feeling that he was about to lose something even bigger, his carefully guarded heart. Brendan had never worked so hard to impress someone in his life. Deals worth billions had been closed with less effort than it took to get Genevieve to agree to a second evening together. But he had accepted the challenge, and if there was one thing he never did, it was surrender. She had told him to earn her time, so he did exactly that. It started small, showing up at the restaurant just before closing, offering to help stack chairs while she finished counting tips. Then came the pastries boxes of carefully selected desserts from the finest bakeries in the city, left at her doorstep with no note, just a silent acknowledgement of her dream. But Genevieve wasn't easily won over by grand gestures. If anything, she seemed more amused than impressed by his efforts, as if waiting to see if he would tire of the pursuit. Brendan didn't. One evening, he arrived outside her apartment building just as a light drizzle began to fall. She stood under the awning, arms crossed, watching him with something unreadable in her expression. You don't give up, do you? She asked, tilting her chin up. He studied her, noting the way the city lights reflected in her dark eyes. Not when something's worth it. A flicker of something passed over her face, but she masked it quickly. And you think I'm worth all this effort? Brendan stepped closer, the faint scent of rain mixing with the warmth of her perfume. I know you are. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet sigh, she reached for his wrist, fingers curling around it gently. Fine, one night, but no fancy restaurants, no private chefs. If you want my time, you meet me on my terms. Brendan didn't hesitate. Tell me where. She chose a rooftop in Brooklyn, one that overlooked the city skyline, but was far from the polished terraces Brendan was used to. The roof was uneven, lined with mismatched chairs and a string of flickering lights someone had strung up years ago. Genevieve had set out 2 paper bags, the scent of burgers and fries filling the air as she gestured for him to sit. This is dinner, he asked, amused. This is real, she corrected, handing him a burger. No waitstaff, no crystal glasses, just food, fresh air, and a view. Brendan unwrapped the burger, taking a bite before responding. You think care about crystal glasses? Genevieve rested her elbow on the table, watching him. I think you've spent so long in a world of luxury that you've forgotten what simple feels like. He considered that as he chewed. Maybe she was right. His life had been built on excess, on power, on always having more. But here, with her, eating fast food on a rooftop, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Content. As the evening stretched on, they talked about everything and nothing. Genevieve told him about the first time she baked as a child, how she had burned an entire batch of cookies but refused to give up. Brendan, in turn, shared stories he rarely told about the early days of his company, the nights he had doubted himself, the sacrifices no one ever saw. At some point, Genevieve leaned back in her chair, stretching her legs out in front of her. "You surprise me, Lancaster." Brendan turned his gaze to her, intrigued. "How so?" She exhaled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Expected a man who only cared about winning, but I think you care more than you let on." Brendan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached across the small table, his fingers brushing over hers. "You make me want to care." The city hummed around them, but in that moment, nothing else existed. Genevieve didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, a silent acknowledgement of everything unspoken between them. For once, Brendan Lancaster wasn't chasing a deal, a victory, or a new business conquest. He was chasing her. And for the first time, she was letting him catch up. Brendan had always believed that control was the key to success. Every decision he made, every business deal he orchestrated, was calculated and precise. But with Genevieve, there was no strategy, no carefully laid out plan. Their connection was unpredictable, raw, and entirely out of his control. And somehow, that didn't scare him, it exhilarated him. Their nights together became a quiet routine, though nothing about it felt routine at all. He found himself drawn to her world, slipping away from his high-rise office to meet her after her shifts. Sometimes, they walked aimlessly through the city, stopping at food stands or listening to street musicians. Other nights, they sat in her tiny apartment, where she tested new pastry recipes and made him try each one, demanding brutally honest feedback. She challenged him in a way no one ever had. She didn't care about his wealth, his influence, or the power his name carried. She cared about the way he listened, the way he remembered the little things like how she hated the taste of artificial vanilla or how she always tapped her fingers against the table when she was thinking. For the first time in years, Brendan felt something shift inside him. But not everyone was as enamored with his newfound distraction. "You're making a mistake." His younger brother, Daniel, leaned against the glass wall of Brendan's office, arms crossed. Unlike Brendan, Daniel had never been one for restraint. He was reckless, impulsive, the kind of man who thrived on luxury without ever having to work for it. Brendan didn't look up from his desk. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." Daniel scoffed. "You don't have to. It's all over the tabloids. Billionaire Lancaster's late-night rendezvous with mystery woman." He tossed a newspaper onto the desk. "You might not care about your reputation, but the board does. Investors don't take kindly to their CEO being seen slumming it with a waitress." Brendan's jaw tightened. "Watch your mouth." Daniel raised a brow. "So it's serious then?" Brendan didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The way his grip tightened on the edge of his desk said enough. Daniel let out a low whistle. Wow, the great Brendan Lancaster actually falling for someone who doesn't have a trust fund. He shook his head. "Look, I'm just saying this isn't going to end well. She's not one of us." Brendan finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "Maybe that's the point." Daniel sighed, pushing off the wall. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." Brendan didn't care about his brother's warnings or the whispers of investors. He had spent his entire life making decisions based on profit and risk assessments. But this wasn't something that could be measured in numbers. That night, he found himself outside Genevieve's apartment once more. She answered the door in an oversized sweater, her hair slightly messy from what he assumed was a long evening of baking. She frowned at the tension in his posture. "What's wrong?" Brendan hesitated. He had never been one to talk about things that bothered him, but Genevieve wasn't just anyone. Slowly, he stepped inside, running a hand through his hair. "The press is starting to dig into us," he admitted, "and my brother thinks I'm making a mistake." Genevieve folded her arms, leaning against the counter. "And what do you think?" Brendan met her gaze, unwavering. I don't care what anyone else thinks." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Good." He exhaled, some of the tension melting away. "You're not worried." She shrugged. "I knew who you were the night we met. I knew what being around you could mean, but also know that I trust you." Something inside him settled at her words. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear them. Genevieve took a step closer, reaching for his hand. "I don't care what the tabloids say. I care about what's real. And this," she squeezed his fingers gently, "this feels real." Brendan had spent his entire life chasing the next big success, the next victory. But standing there, in her tiny apartment that smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, he realized something. For once, he had nothing left to chase. Because everything he wanted was right in front of him. Brendan had spent his life making decisions that shaped empires, but the choice to be with Genevieve felt different. It wasn't about power or strategy, it was about something deeper, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. But the world he lived in didn't allow for simple happiness. The fallout came faster than he expected. The tabloids had already latched onto their relationship, but now board members were whispering about distractions, clients were questioning his focus, and investors were demanding assurance that Lancaster Enterprises wasn't about to be derailed by the CEO's personal life. Brendan had faced pressure before. He had built his company through sheer determination, surviving hostile takeovers, economic downturns, and ruthless competitors. But none of those battles had felt as personal as this one. Because this time, what was at stake wasn't just his company, it was Genevieve. He arrived at her apartment late one evening, tension in every line of his body. Genevieve, still in the middle of icing a tray of pastries, took one look at him and set down the piping bag. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, studying him. Something happened. Brendan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "The board is pushing back harder than I expected. They want reassurance that I'm focused on the company, not," he gestured vaguely, "this." Genevieve leaned against the counter, quiet for a moment. "And what do you want?" He met her gaze, his answer immediate. "You." Her expression softened, but she didn't rush to reassure him. Instead, she considered his words carefully. "Then, why do you look like a man being forced to make a choice?" Brendan sighed, stepping closer. "Because I know how this world works. They'll keep pushing, keep digging. They'll try to turn you into a liability, Genevieve, and I won't let that happen." She crossed her arms, her posture steady. "And what's your solution? Walk away before it gets worse." The idea made his stomach twist. "No," his voice was firm, "but I don't want you caught in the crossfire." Genevieve studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "You don't get to decide that for me, Brendan. If this is real, then we fight for it, together." Her words settled something inside him, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent his life protecting what he built, but Genevieve wasn't something to shield, she was something to stand beside. And she was right. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate his life, least of all the board. The next morning, he walked into Lancaster Enterprises with renewed purpose. He called an emergency meeting, gathering the most influential voices in the company. As they settled into their seats, murmuring about what was to come, Brendan took his place at the head of the table. "I'm aware of the concerns regarding my personal life," he began, his tone measured but firm, "and I'm here to put them to rest." A few of the older board members exchanged glances, waiting for him to continue. My personal life does not dictate my ability to run this company, Brendan said. Lancaster Enterprises has thrived under my leadership for years, and that will not change. What I do outside this office is not up for discussion. One of the senior members, a man who had been trying to undermine Brendan for years, cleared his throat. Mr. Lancaster, while we respect your position, public perception does matter. Investors want stability. Brendan met his gaze without hesitation. And they have it. Our numbers have never been stronger. We're expanding into new markets, increasing profitability. If anyone wants to challenge my leadership, they are welcome to review the data. But if you think we'll make decisions about my personal life based on outdated expectations, you're mistaken. Silence filled the room. Then, one by one, the board members nodded, some reluctantly, others with quiet approval. Brendan had made his stance clear. And with that, the battle was won. He wasted no time after the meeting. He walked straight out of the building, into his car, and drove to Genevieve's apartment. When she opened the door, she barely had time to react before he pulled her into his arms. "It's done," he murmured against her hair. "They won't stand in our way." Genevieve pulled back just enough to search his face. "You're sure?" Brendan cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "Absolutely." Her lips curved into a smile before she pressed them against his, the kiss slow, deep, and filled with the certainty they had both been waiting for. Brendan had conquered business empires, built wealth beyond measure, and secured power that most men only dreamed of. But standing there, holding Genevieve in his arms, he realized something. This was his greatest victory. And he wasn't going to let it go. Months later, Genevieve stood in the kitchen of her very own bakery, the space filled with the warm scent of sugar and freshly baked bread. The grand opening had been a massive success, with customers lining up around the block. At the center of it all was Brendan, dressed in a tailored suit but completely out of place behind the counter, attempting to tie an apron around his waist. Genevieve laughed as she walked over, adjusting it for him. "You really don't have to do this." Brendan smirked. "I lost a bet, remember? I believe I owe you a shift as a bakery assistant." She shook her head, amused. "You're a terrible assistant." He leaned in, his voice low. "But I'm a great investor." Genevieve rolled her eyes, but there was no hiding the affection in them. "Fine, you can stay, but if you break anything, you're paying for it." Brendan chuckled, watching as she moved effortlessly through the bakery, greeting customers and perfecting each display. She had built this, and he had never been prouder. As the evening wound down, Brendan pulled her into his arms, right in the middle of the bakery, not caring who was watching. "This is just the beginning," he murmured against her temple. Genevieve smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I know." And for the first time in both of their lives, they weren't chasing anything. Because they already had everything they needed. Each other. Forever.